Everyone, this is Hua Fangli again. In this short video, we are going to talk about the blurring boundaries among nonprofits, governments, and the business. So the relationship between government and nonprofit organizations, as we talked about, there are complementary, supplementary, or adversarial relationships, not a single view that provides the all accurate picture, right? So these relationships, they overlap, they interact with each other. And from the financial resource standpoint, we can see two major effects that will be government funds either crowd out or crowd in contributions to nonprofit organizations. Well, most of the studies we should note here, they only detect the relationship between government funds and private contributions to nonprofits, right? Either positive, negative, no relationship, or in a linear relationship. But we actually don't have very strong evidence to prove that there will be a causal relationship. Right, so in general, we would just say private contributions to nonprofits positively or negatively associated with government funds to nonprofits. Right, so that's the financial aspects. And then we look at the relationship between nonprofit and the business, the private sector. Right, so then the business nowadays, they have strategic or nonprofit corporate social responsibility strategies, right? And also then the different forms of social enterprise, either a nonprofit social enterprise or a commercial social enterprise, right? So they have the bottom line, try to maximize both financial and social returns, right? So we also have the new developed social bonds, right? Try to maximize the social impacts, etc. So what I try to emphasize here is if you look at the relationship between government and nonprofit organizations, say, okay, government outsourcing or contracting out some of the public service to nonprofit organizations, then we have the phenomenon called the third-party government. It really blurs the boundary between government and nonprofit organizations, right? Some don't even realize this is a nonprofit providing essential public services to citizens. While on the other hand, we also see, okay, you see nonprofit commercialism and business are also involved heavily in social causes, right? So if you try to really use like ownership to look at whether or not this belongs to private, public, and nonprofit activities, is possibly not a good way to distinguish them. Okay, so what I'm saying here is all the boundaries between the three different sectors, they are actually blurring to each other. So then we also have from the voluntary sector standpoint, right? So we have so-called the voluntary failure series. Though I'm not a big fan of this, as I mentioned previously, I would rather address them as nonprofit weakness, right? So nonprofit insufficiency, particularism, paternalism, and amateurism. So you really need to ask yourself, why do you buy it, right? But anyway, the point here is, for some of the problems, especially very difficult social problems, you need all the sectors to work together. And even that possibly will not bring you success. One of the predominant example is the poverty alleviation. Right, so through centuries, people working on alleviating poverty try to shrink the gap between the rich and the poor. But none of the country actually stands out, say, okay, we fully eliminate the poor, right? So it took the effort from the business side. They create jobs, they provide opportunities, etc., right? And the market mechanism benefits uh, both sides on one particular exchange. And from the nonprofit side, many nonprofit efforts have been put in this area, and also not to mention different government programs, right? So in the United States, you have War on Poverty, you have Women, Infant, Children, the WIC program, and you have many other programs try to address, try to help the poor families. But still, we are now looking at, if not saying, okay, the enlarging gap between the poor and the rich, but we really do sense the gap still exists, right? A significant gap between the rich and the poor still exists. Right, so then more efforts needs to be done in this area, and possibly some innovative ways, because traditionally we tried a bit of this, a bit of that, but none of this actually fully brings us a satisfactory result. All right, so that's why that's why the nature of the problem may or leads to the blurring boundary between all the sectors, right? Because you need all the partners to work together. And we also document the significant growth of the nonprofit sector in the past 3 decades. And that has effects on the public sector and on the private sector, right? Because if the relationship is either complementary or supplementary, it will cause either cooperation or competition, right? So regardless of the other parties will be the public sector or private sector organizations. All right, so Westbrook documented or pointed out long ago the future of the nonprofit sector. It says, okay, the 3 sectors, they may work together in some of the areas like poverty alleviation, or they will also compete with each other, right? Create some tensions, especially the relationship is more supplementary, right? Because once the social needs were satisfied, then no longer needs the other sector players to provide the service. And then James Austin James documented all the case studies, look at the strategic collaboration between nonprofits and the business. Nowadays, it's even more complicated. So they can co-branding, they can do social cause marketing with a partner, and they can do strategic corporate social responsibility, or corporations send their employees during working time but ask them to volunteer for nonprofit organization, etc. Right? So there's many more collaborations between the business and the nonprofits. Right? So it really depends what kind of strategy the corporations are adopting, and that will determine what kind of relationship they want to maintain with nonprofit organizations. And also, we also see a significant portion of money pouring into the nonprofit sector is actually from service fees, right? So which means nonprofits are generating commercial revenues, especially for like hospitals, and also nonprofits compete with for-profit counterparts in government contracts, etc. Right? So, and you also have the new and emerging donors, especially those big ones, like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, right, and Mark Zuckerberg and Chan Foundation. So these tech tycoons, they cast huge influence in terms of which area will be supported more, right? Because these players are huge. And then you have the new phenomenon called social entrepreneurship, right? It can either be nonprofit, enjoy the tax benefits, or it can be for profit, right? And while they don't have the tax exempt status, but still they have the social mission is centered in the organization's mission. Right, so this also blurs the boundary because just by name, possibly you won't be able to understand, the organization is a nonprofit or a for-profit, because they do basically the same thing, right? Only the organization legal nature is quite different. All right, so this is the nonprofit's contribution to the civil society summarized here, right? Because this is talking about the marketization of the nonprofit sector, right? So really, it means if you look at the commercial revenue generated or the wins from the contract competition, and then you have the new and emerging donors as well as the social entrepreneurship, right? So the service and those advocacies basically you can see either can be provided by traditional commercial venues or provided by the nonprofit sector, right? So, but if you look through the value guardians and service and the advocacy as well as the social capital generated, you'll see significant differences between different organizations in terms of whether or not the nonprofit sector is marketizing itself. All right, so for the marketization, again, it poses a challenge, right? So how do we view the nonprofit sector nowadays? Are they still the same nonprofit organizations that we are willing to give our money to, right? So this is charitable giving. How will this influence charitable giving, right? So these are the questions we need to further explore. All right, so I think I will stop here for this short video. I think if you want to summarize, right, so what's going on in nowadays, the blurring boundaries across different sectors, you need to look at different cases, right? Some cases are blurring boundaries between nonprofits and the government, and while the others are between nonprofits and the business. Now, it should be noted here, we didn't talk about the relationship between government and the business, but certainly you can argue, right, when government is seeking third-party contractors, private businesses, they can be government contractors as well, right? So that will also create something called the hollow state, right? If you look at the new public management movement starting by the Clinton administration, led by Al Gore, who was the former vice president, and run government like a business is quite an idea, right? But still, it also creates problem that how can we make those private partners or private contractors as accountable as government, because we hold very different accountability standards with government agencies as with private business, right? So that blurs the boundary as well. Okay, that'll be all for this short video.